Hello, welcome to the Korea Society. Thank you for coming. Tonight we have Professor Janet Poole. She's the author of When the Future Disappears, The Modernist Imagination in Late Colonial Korea. And she'll be talking to us about Korean writers in the final decade of Japanese colonial rule. Janet teaches Korean literature and cultural history in the Department of East Asian Studies at the University of Toronto. She's translated the works of many writers from this era, including Lee Tae-jung's Eastern Sentiments. Please join me in welcoming Janet Poole.
Well, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me here today. I was very happy to finally make it. I was supposed to be here in, I think, February when a huge major snowstorm stopped my visit. And then last night in Toronto, it started snowing again. So what can you say? It's not when the future disappears, when spring disappears. And so today I'm going to just talk a little bit about my new book, When the Future Disappears, and through the book a little bit about literature in what I call late colonial Korea. The book is about literature, it's about modernism, and what I call a sense of a disappearing future, which really refers not to the future literally disappearing, but the ways in which in literature and in fiction, the kind of imagination of a future changes, and people start to think about a very repetitive everyday life, about the past. People become obsessed with the past. Antiquarianism rises in stories. Characters all die, or they find old swords or old precious objects and go to museums. Or life goes on, seemingly never changing day after day. These are some of the different ways in which, in late colonial Korean literature, the future seemingly disappears. And I'm interested in the ways this kind of sense of a disappearing future coincides with what's going on in late colonial Korea, in which the kind of imperial state, Japanese imperial state, decided that in a certain sense, Korea should disappear, and the Korean language should also disappear. So language policies moved towards censoring the publication of printed Korean. People were using Japanese more in daily life. And I think that all of the writers whom I'm interested in are thinking through and bringing into question and sometimes even promoting the idea of disappearance, whether that be the disappearing Korean language or a kind of disappearing sense of Korea. When I say late colonial Korea, I'm really referring to the late 1930s, early 1940s, which is a pretty dramatic time. If we think of it in terms of kind of large political events of war. The Second Sino-Japanese War starts in 1937. The Asia-Pacific War starts in 1941. These are two wars that are central to what I call late colonial Korea. It's the time of the very severe repression of communism, which you'll see becomes important for literary figures who are very often firm believers in communism or forms of socialism. It's also, though, a time of pretty intense urbanization and industrialization, and part of this is related to the war economy. So there's a lot of people moving around Korea, moving around the Japanese empire, moving from the countryside to the city, moving from Korea to the Japanese metropole or up to Manchuria. In some ways, it's a very kind of dynamic time. And part of that mobility also is about wartime conscription, about soldiers being conscripted and laborers being conscripted. And this is a very kind of concrete sense of a disappearing future. If you're being conscripted to fight in a war that but at a certain point, it's pretty clear it's going to be lost. Volunteering to fight in that war is one of the more literal senses of potentially giving up a future. So I think that all of these different senses, these events are important and certainly affect the ways in which writers and artists are thinking about a future in their everyday life. But I think that the way in which it affects it is sometimes very complicated and not quite as direct as we think. So in particular, I'd like to stress that what often seems to be a turn to the past in forms of antiquarianism or traditionalism is also not just a turn to the past, so much as an attempt to imagine a different kind of future or an alternative future. So to get to the ending first, the future doesn't disappear at all, right? It's just that the form of the future might take the future might take the form of its own disappearance. Now, that all sounds very abstract, so I will move into more concrete examples of what I'm really talking about. And I'm just going to introduce a few of the writers. I focus on 6 individual writers. I'm going to introduce 3 of them tonight. So in August of 1946, the writer Itaewon, here he is, boarded a Soviet army plane in Pyongyang. The plane circled over the city that had recently become his new home and flew north across the border with the Soviet Union and over the tall buildings of Vladivostok. And then the plane landed in a small town on the outskirts of that city where E's delegation from the Soviet-occupied zone of northern Korea were to be placed in quarantine for 5 to 6 days. Now, E, in fact, ended up staying longer because he got sick, which I guess is what's supposed to happen in quarantine. So the rest of his delegation went on ahead of him, and he stayed there on his own and eventually had to travel on a small propeller plane to Moscow with a couple of other kind of stragglers. It was a 4-day journey, 4 days of flying from Vladivostok to Moscow, sleeping in the plane overnight, and at one stop, even waking up in the morning to find that the plane had gotten bogged down in mud from overnight rain. And at this point, he wrote, a thing called a tractor miraculously freed the plane, and he was able to complete the journey to the capital of the Soviet Empire, Moscow. E was taking part in a 2-month-long tour of the Soviet Union, organized by the Korea Soviet Union Cultural Association, which was based in Pyongyang. For the tour, 2 small planes left Pyongyang carrying a delegation of farmers, laborers, scholars, artists, and politicians. And for 2 months, they were based in Moscow, taking side trips by train to Leningrad in the west, down south to Armenia and Georgia, returning to Moscow via Stalingrad, before finally returning to Pyongyang via the Siberian Railroad. During their visit, they paid visits to cultural institutions, theaters, museums, newspapers. They walked around the city streets, looked in the public spaces, the parks. They looked at houses and apartment buildings. They visited industrial sites. They even went to a tractor factory. And they met with their Soviet equivalents, writers and cultural figures. And they were really especially interested in people from the Korean diaspora in the Soviet Union who had settled there. And later that year, in 1947, he published the diary that he kept during his journey. And here we see the cover of that book. It's a very striking cover by the artist Pak T'aewån. And beneath the stark green titles of the stark green characters of the title, so Soryeon Kihang, which is Record of a Journey to the Soviet Union. We see this illustration, which might be a little distant to you, I'm not sure, but on closer examination, it looks as if we have some kind of vessel containing a musical score a portrait, a large cog, a hammer and sickle, amongst other objects. It's a little hard to make them out. Perhaps it's a ship carrying symbols of industry and culture through rough waters. So, titled Record of a Journey to the Soviet Union, there are photographs of the delegation inserted at the front of the book, which record their journey from a newly liberated land. So we see here the group exiting from a government building in Armenia at the top. We see them at the Kremlin at a farewell reception. We see them here in a clipping from a Moscow cultural newspaper. There's a photograph of Lee Tae-jun, Lee Gi-young, Ho Jung-suk, and other members of the delegation meeting with Russian writers. So E is, I think, third from the right in this picture. So they attracted some attention on their visit. And then we also see them here, a photograph of them at Lenin's mausoleum. Overlaid in this edition, it's a rather old book that I've copied here, overlaid by a print of a previous photograph showing the night sky lit up during the first September 3rd celebration of victory in war by the side of the Moscow River. So actually you can see this is the picture here that you're seeing overlaying this picture. But here at the top, you see an ordinary snapshot of neatly suited dignitaries standing in line for the obligatory group shot, juxtaposed with the sturdy stone of the red square walls and the dazzling lights of the celebrating capital city. And we must not forget, I think, the novelty for this group of being received as representatives of a liberated nation. So it may look like a rather tedious group photo, but this was 1946, 1 year, the first anniversary of the liberation of Korea, the end of the fall of the Japanese Empire. And these visitors, important figures from the northern occupied zone, were traveling recognized as members of a nation, not of a colony, right? And we see if you read through his diary of his journey, there's some very poignant moments. Several of the group purchased world maps. These are newly printed maps of the world on which Korea and Japan are depicted as separate nations in different colors. And he writes that he looks down upon the tiny country of Korea, dwarfed by the enormous breadth of the Soviet Union, which he's about to cross once more. And he's enthralled to see Korea standing there in its very own color. And so to prove to themselves their own post-colonial existence, they carry these maps in their suitcases back to Pyongyang. And we see here in the preface to his diary, he writes a little bit about what this journey meant to him. So I'd like to just read this. As someone who had barely been freed from a long life of slavery to old things in an old world, on this trip to the Soviet Union, I was like a bird flying through the sky for the first time, having been freed from a cage. Those few months were truly enchanting. Everything old and bad connected to humans had disappeared. It was a new world with a new culture, new customs, and the new daily lives of new people. Moreover, although it was new by the day, the Soviet Union was moving forward without end, just like a great river flows toward the eternally stable ocean. So what I think is most striking here is this repetition of the word new, right? The new world, new culture, new customs, new daily lives of new people, buttressed, of course, by this imagined stability of the old empire. So we see here, I think, a man to whom a future had been restored, but when had it been lost? And that's the subject of my book. The sense of time, a very widespread sense of time in late colonial Korea that was actually extraordinarily productive for writers and for artists. So just 5 years before this preface, in 1941, which is really the heart of the late colonial period, right? After the Second Sino-Japanese War had broken out and on the eve of the Asia-Pacific War, Yi had sounded very different when he wrote about old sayings. Here he says he's been freed from a long life of slavery to old things in an old world. 5 years earlier, he was writing things like this. Distance in time is more exotic and mysterious than distance in space. Now here he was actually talking about old language in classical works. And he was very enthralled by the literary classics that somehow had the ability to endure through time. And to actually accrue value over time and to transmit a sense of age itself. And it's a sense of age that he finds so mysterious and exotic. And so exotic that he says at one point that it's actually sacred, that this sense of age is what bestows a sacred nature upon old things. So far from suggesting slavery and confinement to a cage, in 1941, Distance in Time, the ode itself, suggested the mystery and exoticism of a sacred nature. In 1946, to discover that exciting, brave new world, he had to travel 4 days in a plane across an entire continent. But what could he do in 1941 when he wanted to experience travel across time? For E, one answer lay in collecting antiques. He was an antiquarian, a very dedicated antiquarian. And I should stress that 1930s is the age of antiquarianism in Korea. He's not alone in his love of the past. He collected antiques, he loved his antiques, and he wrote about his antiques. He's a writer. A very prolific writer. He wrote serialized novels, short stories, writing guides. He edited newspapers. He wrote short essays. He was a writing teacher. So he's a very literary person. So I'm sure it's natural for him that he would write about his love of antiques. And here's an example from a short essay called Antiques. When my twittering children have all fallen asleep, and even my wife has retired to her bed like a lonely cloud, that is when we look and neither of us grows tired. At one with these antiques, I'm unaware of the deepening night. Now, I chose this quote because I think it reflects not just his attitude towards antiques, but his attitude towards literature itself. So one thing we see here, one element of that attitude we see here is this really intense privatization of experience, this sense of intense solitude of being alone. Elsewhere, he wrote that literature bloomed from the individual alone. He conceived of literature and art as coming out of the isolated, lonely individual. And that's the experience that he tries to have with his antiques. Now, of course, it's a very cultivated loneliness because, as he says here, his wife and children are asleep beside him, right? At one level, he's not alone at all. But nevertheless, he cultivates this sense of solitude that that enables him to experience the past. So I think of it as a kind of faux loneliness. It's also a little bit of faux darkness. He writes a lot about the night, about being alone and being alone at night. And he even went to the extent of forming a group when he was a student in Japan that would meet in a room and turn out the lights and experience the dark together. So this is another example of the kind of the faux light, right? That it's only really having electric lights that enables him to experience the mysterious darkness of pre-electric days, right? Electricity itself allows that. And this is another part of the very contradictory attitude that he has towards the past and towards art itself. And we see another example here where again he's writing about his antiques, and he talks a little bit about more specifically the kind of objects that he likes. So he writes here that we're able to easily shut ourselves up for several days, enjoying the hanging of a picture anew or changing the place of one empty dish. I hope he's exaggerating here, because if you spend several days to move a dish to the side, I'm not sure. It's a little exaggerated, I'm sure. But we become immersed in stillness and a sense of proximity. It is because of this that the extreme short-sighted nature of antiquarians is apt to form. It is an empty dish and empty vase. It does not contain rice cakes or water, but silence and emptiness. Already it is no longer a vessel, but a world, a universe. To someone else, it may look no more than a fragment of porcelain, but to its owner, it is an endless landscape and a sublime temple. So we again see this sense of absorption that the individual has in gazing upon a picture or an empty dish, becomes this intense individual privatized experience that really creates a whole world in and of itself. That's how he describes it. And a world that's kind of sublime, it's sacred, and in somewhat contradictory nature. It gives him a sense of intimacy or proximity. Now, he said that distance in time was mysterious and exotic, but he's also saying that it brings a sense of proximity and intimacy with that distance in time. So he's not the most consistent person. But he is consistent, I think, in continually seeking out these kind of experiences, whether they're pre-electric or kind of stylized, pre-modern visions of the solitary literary gentleman, the hermit who sits in his hut up a mountain on his own. He tries to live this out, but in the city, in his living room at home, with his family beside him, right? So he always has in balance this very kind of stylized way of living that's always part of urban, capitalist, highly commodified, very busy 1930s soul life. And for him, the other attraction with things like darkness, with antiques, and being alone is this idea of fantasizing a life that's somehow outside of the contingencies of capitalist culture. So he talks here in this final quotation on antiques, he talks about the kind of antiques he likes, and he really likes Joseon porcelain. And this is how he explains his preference. He says that they were not developed as commodities, unlike those of China or the Japanese metropole. Now, anyone who reads late 30s Korean magazines, there are endless comparisons between China, Japan, and Korea. So this is one of them. Korean pots are not commodified. And so although the hands of the craftsmen were expert, their hearts were as pure as children. Pots made by experienced hands, with hearts lacking in worldly desire, are closer to nature than to artifice. These pots may not catch the eye at first glance, but the eye never tires of looking at them, and so an attachment is formed. Once our troubled eyes or hearts reach there and find comfort in the absence of words, we begin to think of the distant past, which appears immense, but there's no sense of suffocation, only a pure heart remaining. So we see here an example of the extreme comfort that he gets from these objects. We also get a little bit of a glimpse of the kind of objects he's looking at. He likes objects that have been used, that have scratches or that are broken, because when they're scratched or broken, he can feel the past in them and he can see age. And it's really that age, that sense of time that he's looking for rather than the object itself. So he's not really interested in pristine, valuable antiques. He wants old bits of pots that suggest to him how people ate out of them or drank from them over the years. And he wants to imagine that somehow the production of those pots has been very lacking in consciousness, that they're somehow organically, naturally produced from the hands of the craftsmen, not from their minds. This is sheer fantasy, obviously, and he's not alone in indulging in this fantasy. But I think the important thing to me is to try to think about why he wants to create this fantasy of the craftsman who lacks self-consciousness. What I think all of these writings on antiques suggest, to me at least, is that he's an exceedingly modernist antiquarian, right? Someone whose desire for the non-commodified, the pre-electric, the unself-conscious actually arises from the prevalence of all of those features in his time. So we get a sense of 1930s Korea as a place that's become very commercialized, very busy. The technology, such as electricity, is becoming widespread, and that there's a kind of rationalized ways of being have proliferated to the extent that he is now desiring to escape from them, to try to create some other space. And the way in which he does that is through writing literature. The biggest irony of all being that he's one of the very few writers in colonial Korea who actually made a living as a writer. By writing all those novels and teaching and writing guides, he could actually support himself financially. So that's the kind of underlying largest irony of all. So he's someone who turns out the light to talk to his antiques at night, but in the daytime would take the bus into the city to work at the newspaper. And weekends he would take the bus to go fishing somewhere where there's no trace of civilization, but of course the high-speed bus gets him there. So this is a very familiar, I think, way of living to us, right, in many ways. Now, E's favorite form of writing was, perhaps unsurprisingly, what I call the anecdotal essay. These are kind of short personal essays, about 2 or 3 pages, a writer kind of meditating upon his daily life, something he thought of when he was sat in the garden or when he was eating his tea, just really anything that comes to mind. They're supposed to be, the idea is that they're written down rather kind of lightly, but that can be a little bit of illusion because some of these can be quite stylized. Now what I'm showing you here is 2 book covers, for his most famous collection, which in Korean is called Musorok, which can translate as essays without a preface or random essays, neither of which really translates very well into English. And when I translated this, I just changed the title because randomness never sounds good in English, right? It just doesn't work. So I took the title of one of the essays within the volume, which is Eastern Sentiments. And you have here on the left-hand side the 1941 book cover, which was painted by Itaewon's friend Kim Young-jun, who was a very famous artist and antiquarian. And they were also very good friends. And on the right, you have the translation and the beautiful cover designed by Chang Jae, who's here, I'm so happy to see, of the translation, which also came out from Columbia University Press a couple of years ago, which features, in contrast to the Narcissi that Kim Young-jun painted on his cover, we've got an orchid painted by 18th century literatist Kim Jong-hee, who was a famous calligrapher that Itaewon particularly adored and wrote about a lot. So it seemed very appropriate to have it on the cover. So this is one of E's most famous books. When I say that I don't think it's surprising he chose this form, The reason I say that is because in some ways, the short essay seems to be copying what old Confucian gentlemen would have done, which was to write about their moral beliefs, their moral world, animals, their garden, books they had read. That has a very long tradition throughout East Asia, right? But what's interesting is that in 1930s Korea, the anecdotal essay was having a renaissance. And part of that renaissance was related to the increasing commercialism in print culture, that newspapers, journals, magazines were proliferating. There were more print pages that needed filling, and little short essays are quite convenient for doing that, kind of like op-eds or something like that. So that's one reason that the anecdotal essay really comes into its own in the 1930s. I think a second reason is because they're somehow very conducive to a kind of frantic, fragmented, busy urban life. And he himself wrote in one of his essays that today people are when pieces are published in journals, it sometimes says how many minutes it takes to read them underneath. Kind of like when we fill out the census or whatever, we're supposed to do it in 10 minutes. So that was going on then too. So there's a certain way in which this form, fragmented short form, somehow reflects a very modern, fragmented life. And I think that reflects Lee Tae-jun. He's a very urbane man. You can see him here. This sign photo, I think you can just see the sign at the bottom. This was actually given to me by the daughter of one of his former students. So I think of him, he taught writing at girls' school. And I think of him when I see this picture as a kind of rock star writing teacher handing out his signed photo. Clearly that was done at that time, and he's quite good looking, so why not? Other photos of Lee Tae-jun at the time show him as a man of quite modern hobbies. So here's a picture. He's third from the right here, visiting a temple. And I like this picture because they've got their ties and their jackets, and then their trousers are stuck in their socks, right? It's a wonderful contrast. But clearly they've hiked up to this temple. Hiking being a major hobby of 1930s Korea. And then I believe, this is his wedding day. You see he had a very modern wedding, antiquarian that he was. He didn't act that out in the old style. And then I think finally we have this picture of him and his wife and his children in the garden of his house in Seongbuk-dong. This house, he also wrote about an essay about how he had it built by old-fashioned carpenters who were so skilled they didn't need to measure anything or use nails. And the joy for E was to watch them and especially to listen to them, because he felt when he heard their authentic conversations that he was getting a real whiff of the pre-modern past. So this is a kind of classic act of restoration, which has perhaps met its natural end, because if you go to Seongbuk-dong today, I don't know if anyone here has been, you can actually go to the house. It's now a traditional tea house, and you can have some traditional or not so traditional tea, but it tastes good anyway, so you should go. So it might seem ironic that the house that he built, according to these pre-capitalist standards, is now a thriving business. There's hardly an empty seat whenever I go there. But in some ways, it actually captures the contradictions of Lee Tae-jun and of late colonial Korea, right, where this kind of modern capitalist culture is really infiltrating and promoting some of the most kind of traditional cultural forms. Now, he was not alone in becoming interested in the past at this time. I think I have one more page. This is a little shrine inside the tea house of his books and the picture in the garden at the top. He was not alone in becoming interested in the past at this time, and I don't want to suggest that he went unchallenged, because there were some people who seriously disagreed with what he was doing. And in my book, I do write about a philosopher and Communist Party member called Insik, who directly challenged ease absorption in the past. Now, unfortunately, Sa doesn't have such an eloquent photographic record, so this is the best I could do. I think there are reasons for that, and it doesn't really, you can just about see on the cover a kind of very grainy photograph from a newspaper. And on the right-hand side, you have the 1938 frontispiece of his big work called Culture and History and Culture from the Diet Library. He was a Communist Party member who went to prison for 5 years, was released in 1936. And upon his release, he started to write about philosophy. He had actually pre-prison, he had studied at the very prestigious Waseda University in Japan. So when he was released in 1936, he wrote prolifically about philosophy and about things going on in his time, cultural theory, until 1940, after which all records of him disappear. We don't know what happened. He's not the kind of person that records remain of, not the kind of person that photographs remain. There are rumors that he showed up in North Korea, but we really don't know. In his last known writings in 1940, he was writing about or trying to understand why everyone was so nostalgic. He thought that nostalgia was his contemporary disease, that he could see all around him. And so his way of approaching this is quite interesting. He tries to think about different kinds of nostalgia. And he's quite adamant that people are nostalgic about different things and for different reasons. And he's also quite interesting in that he doesn't want to just condemn nostalgia. He wants to rescue some forms of nostalgia, which might be useful for us because I think we also live in a fairly nostalgic age. So he came up with this taxonomy of nostalgia where there's three kinds, he said, what he called the feudal, the modernist, and the decadent. And the feudal nostalgia was what he accused Itaewon of. It was people who were obsessed with old things. He also accused Pak T'aewån, another writer of the time, of being obsessed with old things. Pak T'aewån didn't write about antiques, but he wrote about the old neighborhood as if it had gone. And that was also feudal, according to Insik. I might add I disagree with Insik's appraisal here of this as feudal, but that's what he thought. Being too obsessed with old things was feudal and it needed to be overcome. But there was another kind of nostalgia that he also found problematic, and that's what he called the modernist nostalgia. And the modernist nostalgia was the nostalgia for an earlier time of the nostalgia of the modern. So it was kind of a 1930s nostalgia for the 1910s, right? And he associated this with the poet Imhwa, another left-wing socialist poet and critic, who had in the 1920s been writing a lot of poetry about the vibrant city streets as a site of revolution and demonstrations. But by 1930s, he was writing poems with titles like, where have those streets gone? Where is my home gone? There's no more revolution. It's just commercialism everywhere. So this was an example of the kind of modernist or modern nostalgia that Insik diagnosed, this kind of yearning in the 1930s of this kind of now middle-aged generation for their youth. And part of that yearning was a yearning for a time when forms of political action were conceived as possible and to have some potential, and that therefore this implied they no longer did. So the final form of nostalgia, and the one that Insik found the most hopeful, was what he called the decadent nostalgia. And the decadent nostalgia is a kind of universal sense of having no roots. And he associates this with the generation who had not lived through the 1910s and 20s period of possibilities. He says that now nobody has a hometown, no one has a home. And so it's a kind of nostalgia that doesn't have an object. It doesn't have an antique. It doesn't have a hometown. It's just an intense sense of disquiet with the present moment. And that's what Insik liked about it, because it kind of refused to reconcile with the present. It was just generally kind of felt a sense of disquiet with the present. And it didn't try to overcome that in the way that fascists at the time were doing, right? Fascists at the time were also dissatisfied with the present, but they would try to overcome it by returning to the past or some romantic agrarian dream. For Insik, the decadent nostalgic would not resort to that attempt to overcome. It would just stay in the disquiet. So that was his kind of taxonomy that he came up with, which gives a sense of different ways in which people are thinking about the past at that time and its relation to different politics, essentially. Sal wrote in his very final essay, we don't know what happened to him after. That essay was called The Beauty of Longing in Decadence. He wrote that the deluge of mourning and decadence in this land will not be extinguished without some new transition. In 1940, in his writing, this land means Korea. Korea cannot be spoken. It's one of those forms of disappearance. So the words this land take its place throughout his writing. And then he also wrote some, I think, pretty powerful words about the kind of status or the nature of the past in this time. He wrote that when we submerge ourselves in the memories of something old that has been lost, the past returns once more to the present like a phantom. In other words, he acknowledges that the past has been lost, unlike some of the other nostalgics, right? The past returns once more to the present like a phantom. Only memories can be mine eternally. No power on earth can steal those memories of old things which rise in our emotional world. But the phantom will always remain a mere phantom. The past is not, in a full sense, the present. Now, you can imagine by 1940, to write that no power on earth can steal those memories of old things is quite a powerful statement, right, for the past and for memory and its possibilities. And I think for me, at least, equally powerful is the fact that he says that past is always a phantom, right? He can reclaim the power of the memory without imagining it's kind of we could actually return to the past. In other words, his way of dealing with the past is looking for a new future, right? He doesn't want to go back to the way things were. He wants a better future, right? And the past or memories of the past may help us to get there, right? But they won't become these kind of museum pieces that will not change. So I find this a very kind of powerful way in which he was thinking through the past in his time. So these are two figures who have pretty, I think, distinct politics at the time they're writing. I just want very briefly to come to one more, and I want to come through him through brief mention of the fact that as the language policies shifted in the early 1940s especially, this had a profound effect on Korean writers, on writers like Itaewon, who made their living by writing in the Korean language, because gradually it became harder and harder to publish in the Korean language. Interestingly, Eastern Sentiments was printed actually in 1944. It was reprinted. But in general, the vernacular press was shut down in 1940, most journals in 41. There were fewer and fewer places to publish unless you would publish or write in Japanese. And there was one journal called Kokumin Bungaku, or Imperial National Literature, that was published from 1943 that contained some Korean but mostly Japanese fiction. And this journal was run by the editor Chaeså, it very openly supported the Japanese imperial policies. Perhaps surprisingly, because Chaes๊ himself had actually been a literary critic who had celebrated the great Korean modernists for writing in Korean. But at this point, he turned towards supporting the writing in Japanese. So at this time, we see that Japanese language is becoming increasingly prevalent, especially in print culture. This is a kind of child's version of the imperial oath in Korean on the left and Japanese on the right. It's a simplified version for children who would then have to, in school, pay their respects to the Japanese empire. And this would also appear on the front of this journal, Kokumin Bungaku, every time it was published. And we also see an increasing amount of journals such as this one called Shokokumin, which means something like young national citizen or young imperial citizen. It's a kind of pro-army, pro-Japanese young person's magazine that depicts the child soldier. So I'd like you to keep this image in mind as I bring you to the final part, which is a story by Kim Namch'on, who was another leftist socialist writer in the 1920s and 30s, who in 1943 wrote his first and only story that he wrote in Japanese. And it was published in Kokumin Bungaku. And normally, the kind of given story is that if you write in Japanese, it's propaganda. If you publish your story in Kokumin Bungaku, it's propaganda. And very little attempt is made to actually then read the story or think about what people were actually writing. And what struck me as I read through the pages of that magazine, actually, is there are some surprisingly nuanced reflections on what's going on and what the future might be. And Kim Namch'on wrote one of them. In his story, it's called One Morning, Aru Asa. And it's basically a short piece where his wife is in labor, about to give birth to his fifth child. He's lost his first wife in labor, and he's got 4 girls. So he's struck by 2 thoughts. 1, will his second wife also die in labor? 2, will he have a son at last? And it's a custom to leave the house while the woman is in labor. So he takes the 2 oldest children and he goes to the park. The local park is Namch'on Park. It's in downtown Seoul. It kind of winds up a mountain overlooking the downtown. You can go there today. And the story basically is just what he's thinking about as he walks around this park, worrying about his wife, worrying about the fact that good leftist, progressive that he is, he really does want a son after all. So maybe he's sexist and he's worried about this, but he's also decided to just accept it maybe. And also thinking about his past. He remembers a man called Mr. K, who he used to meet in the park every day, who was very gracious. He was a publisher who was dedicated to publishing Korean books in Korean and was a kind of epitome of the dignified, older Korean man. And while he's thinking of him, he walks into this man, Mr. S, who's got his groupies and he's walking around the park. And he's obviously a kind of fairly young opportunist who's doing very well in the current moment, 1943, and it's kind of pretty despicable. And so he's struck by the contrast between Mr. S and Mr. K and how they relate to his past and present. He used to write, but now he's stopped writing. How does he place himself in this? So at the end of the story, the wife is okay. He has a son. So he goes back out into the street, and in this very final scene, he walks into a group of school children, a group of shokokumin, right? It's the same word, deliberately so. And he says that just as I was passing in front of the elementary school, I walked into 2 lines of children, in 2nd grade perhaps, flowing out of the school gates for an outing in the charge of 4 or 5 teachers, and noisily making merry in 2 military columns. With hands held in pairs and little rucksacks on their backs, What should I say? The procession was lively and bright. I stood still, unaware of the passing of time, and watched over that winding procession of little national subjects until its tail had flowed out into the street, kicking up dust. And then, all of a sudden, I thought I could see my own 5 children in their midst. And wasn't that Mr. S's youngest son too? And Kay's grandchildren too? I could hardly hold all my thoughts together. Now, I find this extraordinary kind of vision of looking at these children and seeing them as child soldiers, basically, in military formation. The soldier of the future, just like this, these images were all around him. The procession's lively and bright in the terms of the propaganda of the age. We have to be lively and bright and win the war. But then he sees his own children in their midst, his own future, his children's future. And the fact that all of these people, all different politics, opportunists, dignified gentlemen, are all going to be merged or submerged into this vision of the future. And he can hardly hold all his thoughts together, which is probably at 1943 the best that he couldn't write more clearly than that. But it tells me at least that this is not simple propaganda in this book, but a very kind of melancholic vision of the future, written, of course, by someone who does not know that 2 years later the war will end. And that's what we have to remember, that we know their future and they didn't. Most of these writers that I write about, actually, they did go to the north, with the exception of Chaeså, the editor of Kokumin Bungaku, who stayed south. Itaewon, Kim Namch'on, Imhwa, maybe Seo Insik, we don't know. They all chose to go to the north. Some of them, Kim Namch'on, Imhwa, was not surprising. Itaewon, given his kind of dilettantish past, it seems a little surprising maybe that he would choose to go there. Although you have to remember the lore of that brave new world that he described it, or that I presented to you at the beginning, that maybe even for E, who was so dedicated to rescuing art from the evils of commodities and capitalist culture, maybe for him North Korea at that time offered the best possibility. Unfortunately, as the purges began in the north in the 1950s, none of these fared very well. E was sent into internal exile, probably. We don't know when he died. Imhwa and Kim Namch'on were probably executed. Seo Insik, we don't really know if he got there. He probably did, and we don't know what happened after. We actually only have their question marks for the end of their birth dates. We don't know how they ended up, and we have no way, at least at the moment, of knowing their precise futures, ironically. But I think we can at least try to stop thinking about them in terms of factions, the way that we tend to tell North Korean history in the 1950s, and try to start thinking about the motivations, right? The prehistory of that search for a future. And that's what I try to do in this book. And I do think that trying to understand their art, their literature, their aesthetics, and the dreams, the futures they tried to believe in does help us to understand a little bit the choices they made, not knowing the future that was really going to come and hit them. So thank you.
Would you like to take some questions from the audience?
Sure, yeah.
If we have any. Okay, John.
I can talk.
Oh, I see.
This thing always makes me nervous.
I think because they're recording, right? So that's why. Yeah, I can hear you, but yeah.
Yeah, okay.
The machine needs to hear you.
Professor Poole, I really enjoyed your presentation. I'm 84 years old, so I thought you might say something about Lee Kwang-soo, Choi Nam-sun, along with the Itaewon.
Okay. Mhm.
And I hope you may get to them somehow. Let me present these questions to you. It is unfortunate, of course. To me, those three people, among others, genius. I remember how much I was moved and was reading 70 years ago. Unfortunately, some of our label now 친일파, if not 공산당 or lefty. Do you see their qualitative work, or depth their thinking and all, comparable or better or less today's Korean writer, if you're familiar with them? If not, at least, how those three people compare in terms of their work or thinking?
Well, I certainly see them. I think that colonial literature in general, to me, is incredibly vibrant and dynamic and experimental. And if you look at someone like Lee Kwang-soo, what he was doing in terms of literature was really really fascinating. So yeah, I definitely think they're the equals of contemporary Korean writers. Most definitely, yes.
Can I just give a follow-up?
Sure.
I was really thrilled with Itaewon as well as Lee Kwang-soo. Is any reason why you chose Itaewon?
Okay.
Not Chunwon?
Okay. Well, because in the book I'm really focusing on late colonial Korea, so the very 30s and 40s when Lee Kwang-soo was writing, of course. But part of it is expedient. I would like to write about everyone, but I just want one person per chapter so I can give them some justice, right? So part of it is just choosing by expedience. I think part of it also is that one thing I'm really interested in are the kind of different shorter literary forms like the anecdotal essay, poetry, philosophy, criticism, the kind of what we call, I guess, literary scholars call minor forms. So not the novel, but these other forms that have not become so canonical. And I'm kind of interested in those forms and what writers can do in those forms. So that's why I chose Lee Tae-jun, because I think his best writing is actually in these short essays. And I find these short essays fascinating for what they suggest about that time. Now, Lee Kwang-soo's best writing is really in long novels, and they're really great. But it didn't quite fit in with what I was trying to think about in this book. But I'm actually a big fan of the long novels in Lee Kwang-soo. So one day I want to write about those. But there's a lot of the future in them. I was focusing on the disappearing future, so there's quite a lot of futurity in early Lee Kwang-soo, at least. So yeah, I would like to read those too.
Thank you.
Can you tell us a little bit about Chaeså? He was a Shakespearean, and apparently he was quite known for that.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Chaeså is kind of fascinating to me. He was especially after the war, he wrote a lot about Shakespeare, but actually even during the war, in the work I wrote about, he published in 1943. It's a long collection of essays on Korean literature in the age of transition. And he actually has a whole theory of tragedy, which is very influenced by Shakespearean tragedy, but it's kind of somewhat scarily used to talk about the war situation and what's going on. In other words, he basically, by the end of the book, says he wants a tragedy, right? He wants a new form to match the current times. And one thing that tragedy does do is kind of wipe the slate clean and allow for new beginnings. Now, that's not to say that Shakespeare is fascist, but clearly that way of thinking about tragedy can be very conducive to that kind of thinking. But Chaes๊, I mean, he not only studied Shakespeare, but also introduced British modernism. And he did extraordinary work in the mid-30s for Korean modernists like Insik and Pak T'aewån. His writing on his literary criticism on Insik and Pak T'aewån, I think, really heavily influences the way that people still write about them today. So he's had a lot of staying power. But I would like to know more about, I haven't actually read what he wrote after the war about Shakespeare. I would actually like to read those works and find out some more about what happens when, the irony for me in this book is that he was the one person who so openly declared that he had found a future and that future was better. But then that was not the future he got, right? Not that any of us get the futures we're planning, but he certainly didn't get that. So quite, what happened after is something I would like to investigate, but I haven't actually read his works from the 50s and 60s. I think that would be fascinating.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. It is really, I learned a lot from your talk, and I was fascinated by your way of connecting all these writers, and especially you're focusing on, many literary scholars tend to focus on long novels or short stories, and you introduced us to these relatively unknown genres and different types of literary forms. So I really appreciate that. So this is kind of ironic because all these writers are kind of one of the past contemporary Korean literary critics are kind of nostalgic about. So their modernist gestures or their modernist writings actually are consumed in a very similar way in which they wanted to think about the past in those times. So I would like to ask you about, how these, what do you think about how these writers are conceived as one of those, very advanced but also very nostalgic kind of writers in South Korea now? And the other question is, could you tell us a little bit more about how their works were received by, the general public at the time, and how, it actually affected their way of writing as a means of communication with the general public or the masses. Since he brought up the question of Lee Kwang-soo, despite his blatant elitist attitude toward the masses, he was the most popular literary writer at the time. So I just wonder how their works were received by them.
Right. Well, I think that I'm not sure I'm comfortable talking about the masses reading in colonial Korea, because I don't think that's the situation, really. There's a lot of masses that don't read. So definitely Lee Kwang-soo was more popular. He's much easier to read. And if you pick up Lee Kwang-soo, he's quite easy to read, whereas some of these guys can be very, very trying, to say the least. So he's a... And it's also true in terms of genre that someone like Lee Tae-jun too wrote popular novels. I didn't talk about those, but he was also doing what Lee Kwang-soo was doing. So I don't think they're that distinct, except that Lee Tae-jun definitely had a separate kind of project that he was doing in these essays and some of his other writing that was less popularly oriented, right? It was trying... I think by the time he was writing in the 1930s, that this kind of division between popular and less popular or pure, whatever, different words were put onto that, right? Different categories were constructed to describe an idea of a literature that would be more popular and easy to consume and one that would be harder to consume. And he kind of worked self-consciously within that, writing some things that are easier and some things that are not easy. In terms of, I think you're right that people are now very nostalgic about them being nostalgic, right? Which doesn't surprise me at all. That's the logic of nostalgia, surely. Especially like Musorok, even since I first read it in the past 10 years, every time I go back to Korea, there's a new version and it's got a even prettier cover than before. And not to mention that half the essays have been taken out because it's been made easier to consume and so that's just one book that it's kind of fascinating to me. It has a publication date or reprint date of 41, 42, and 44, which is pretty unusual. Now, I don't know how many copies they were. I don't think they would have been a large number of copies. But just the fact that it got reprinted like that in that time is pretty amazing, and I would think quite unique. But it's interesting, since the 1990s, I can't imagine how many times it's been reprinted, right? Nostalgics are interested in nostalgia, right? Which doesn't really bode well for me. But anyway, I think that's a kind of logic. It's almost like the modern nostalgia that Insik diagnosed, where they're nostalgic for a time when, they had kind of hope or youth. It's almost like that kind of repetitive logic where you're nostalgic for a time where you could be truly nostalgic or something like that. I think it's quite fascinating. But I haven't even had a chance, sadly, to talk about Myõngik, who's my favorite writer. And I begin the book with him. And he's someone that seems to have almost disappeared. He hasn't evoked the same nostalgia from contemporary writers. So I guess what I'd like to say, it's a little selective. Who's popular today is a little selective, and there's complicated reasons around that, right? So I tried not to just focus on the ones who are popular today, but I did emphasize Itaewon rather a lot, just because there's so many pictures and that of him with the other guys. I don't even know what they look like. Like, the written record is destroyed, sadly. So he got a little bit of attention, maybe more than he deserved. Thank you.